There are women who are believed because they are loud, and there are women who are believed because they were right all along, and the world finally caught up. On the afternoon of October 9th, 1989, Rosalie Becker stood at the doorway of the small cedar-shingled photo shed in the backyard of her property on the western slope of the Taconic Range, watching a young woman climb the gravel path from the driveway. The young woman was carrying a tan canvas messenger bag and a microcassette recorder. Rosalie was 57 years old, widowed since the spring of 1973, retired from 28 years of teaching fourth grade at Pleasant Valley Elementary School, and she had not given an interview to anyone since the local paper had run a hit piece about her in the summer of 1974. She had spent the previous afternoon walking through her photo shed and counting the leather-bound albums on the wall shelf. There were 46. They contained, between them, 18,247 dated Polaroid photographs of the night sky over the Hudson Valley, taken every clear evening between the 11th of April 1969 and the night just before. Before we begin, drop a comment with where you are watching from. And if stories of quiet witnesses being proven right after decades of ridicule speak to you, hit that subscribe button so we can keep telling them. Because what was about to happen on the front page of the New York Times the following Sunday morning, October 15th, 1989, was going to confirm 20 years of careful documentation that one retired schoolteacher had kept in a cedar shed on a Hudson Valley hillside alone. Between the autumn of 1982 and the autumn of 1989, the Hudson River Valley experienced what civilian researchers would eventually classify as one of the largest single-region, unidentified aerial phenomenon waves in the post-war history of the United States. The sightings clustered in Westchester County to the south, Putnam County in the middle, and Dutchess County to the north, with extensions east across the state line into Connecticut and south toward the northern suburbs of New York City. Across those 7 years, civilian estimates would eventually place the total number of witnesses at between 5,000 and 7,000, with a smaller core of roughly 200 witnesses who reported multiple separate sightings. The most described object across the wave was a massive boomerang-shaped formation of soft amber lights, estimated at between 500 feet and 1,000 feet across, moving silently south along the Hudson River corridor at low altitude, sometimes hovering for as long as 10 minutes. The institutional response was the same response that had been deployed against rural witnesses since the days of Project Blue Book. The Federal Aviation Administration explained the sightings as ultralight aircraft from a private airfield in Stormville, New York, despite the fact that the witnesses included commercial pilots, police officers, and retired military air traffic controllers who knew what an ultralight looked like and what one did not look like. The local newspapers were inconsistent. Some ran sympathetic eyewitness profiles. Most buried the story or treated it as folk color filler. The national press did not seriously enter the story until October of 1989. By that point, the wave had been going for 7 years. The witnesses had been ridiculed, paranoid, and embarrassed for 7 years, and a handful of careful private observers had been keeping records that no one was reading. Rosalie Becker was one of those observers. Hers was the most complete. Rosalie had been born in March of 1932 in a small farmhouse on the eastern edge of Pleasant Valley, New York, the older of 2 daughters of a Methodist apple farmer named Heinrich Becker and a schoolteacher mother named Greta. Her childhood smelled of cider mash in the autumn and chalk dust in the school year. She graduated from Pleasant Valley High School in 1950, attended the New York State College for Teachers in Albany on a partial scholarship, earned her teaching certificate in 1954, and returned to Pleasant Valley to teach 4th grade at the elementary school where her mother had taught 3rd. She married Daniel Becker, a soft-spoken man 6 years older than her, who managed a feed and grain operation in Hopewell Junction on June 20th, 1955. They lived in the small white clapboard farmhouse on the hillside that Daniel's father had built in the 1920s. They did not have children of their own. Daniel had 2 children from a first marriage that had ended in widowhood. Rosalie raised his son Calvin and his daughter Frida as if they were her own. The marriage was quiet, careful, and tender. Daniel had been a Navy radio man in the Pacific in 1945 and had returned home with a habit of looking at the sky at night and naming the stars to no one in particular. He had given Rosalie her first camera, a Kodak Brownie, as an engagement gift in 1954. She had been photographing birds, gardens, and her stepchildren's birthdays for 15 years by the time the first sighting happened. Her teaching career had given her a temperament that suited the work she did not yet know was waiting for her. 4th grade teachers, she sometimes told Daniel, were the last teachers in a child's life who were still allowed to be patient. By the time a child reached the 5th grade, the curriculum was beginning to harden, the testing was beginning to shape the classroom, and the time available for the slow, careful work of teaching a 9-year-old how to think about the world was beginning to run out. Rosalie Becker had taught 4th grade for 15 years by the spring of 1969. She had taught more than 300 children. She had read more than 100 student-written compositions per year. She had developed, over those 15 years, the kind of patient, careful eye that could read a child's anxiety in a single sentence of a science fair report, that could spot a struggling reader from across the classroom by the way they held their head over the page, that could see the small, slow patterns that a faster teacher would miss. That eye, applied later to the Hudson Valley night sky, would turn out to be the eye that the Hudson Valley needed. She did not know that yet on the night of Friday, April 11th, 1969, when the first photograph in what would eventually become the most complete civilian record of the 1980s. Hudson Valley unidentified aerial phenomenon wave entered her possession. On the night of Friday, April 11th, 1969, Rosalie Becker was sitting on the porch of the hillside farmhouse waiting for Daniel to finish closing up at the feed and grain. The time was 9:45 p.m. The sky was clear. The new moon meant that the stars were unusually visible. Rosalie was reading a book of poems by Mary Oliver under the porch light. At 9:53 p.m., she noticed a faint orange glow moving south along the eastern ridge of the Taconic Range, approximately 12 miles distant. She set down the book. She watched the glow for 30 seconds. It did not move like an airplane. It did not blink like an airplane. It was completely silent. She reached for the Polaroid land camera model 250 that she had bought herself the previous Christmas to photograph her father's apple harvest, set it on the porch railing, framed the eastern ridge, and pressed the shutter. The photograph developed in her hand over the next 90 seconds. When the image stabilized, what was visible on the white-bordered print was a single soft orange light suspended above the dark silhouette of the Taconic Range, framed by the line of the Becker's apple tree at the corner of the porch. She showed it to Daniel when he came home at 10:30. He looked at it. He looked at her. He said, "You ought to keep taking those." She asked him later, after the dinner dishes had been put away, what he thought it had been. He sat with the question for a long minute at the kitchen table. He said, In 1944, I was on a destroyer in the Solomon Islands. We tracked something for 2 hours on the radar that was not anything the chief radio man or the captain or anyone on the ship could name. We were ordered not to speak about it. We did not speak about it. I have thought about it every clear night since I came home. He looked at the Polaroid again. He said, "You ought to keep taking those, because somebody ought to be keeping a record, and it is not going to be the Navy." Rosalie filed the photograph in a brown manila envelope she found in Daniel's desk drawer. She wrote on the envelope in blue ballpoint, April 11th, 1969, East Ridge of the Taconic, 9:53 p.m. Single orange light, Polaroid. She wrote the same information in a small spiral notebook she kept in the kitchen and stored on the third shelf of the pantry. She did not tell anyone outside the house. She took another Polaroid the following night of an empty sky and slipped it into the same envelope. She had decided, between Friday night and Saturday night, that she would do this every night the sky was clear, for as long as Daniel was willing to be her witness. She did. The decision to photograph the sky every clear evening was made on the night of April 11th, 1969, and she kept that decision for 20 years and 6 months. She started a leather-bound logbook the following week. She wrote on the first page in her neat schoolteacher's cursive, "Becker Hudson Valley Sky Index. Started April 11th, 1969. Below that, she ruled 4 columns: date, time, sky conditions, brief description. She cross-referenced each Polaroid by a sequential index number written lightly in pencil on the white border of the print. She bought a second Polaroid camera in 1970. She bought a Polaroid SX70 in 1976 and switched to it as her primary. By the spring of 1973, 4 years into the practice, the logbook contained 1,412 entries. Approximately 95% of the entries were ordinary night skies, empty starscapes, moonlit clouds, the rising Pleiades, a passing aircraft. The remaining 5% were anomalies, lights that did not move like aircraft, silent triangular formations, single orange points hovering above the Taconic ridge for minutes at a time. She did not speculate about what they were. She documented them. Daniel Becker died on a Wednesday morning in May of 1973. He had a heart attack while loading a freight pallet at the Feed and Grain at 6:55 a.m. He was 53 years old. The funeral was held at First Methodist on the Green. The pews were full. Rosalie wore a navy wool suit that her mother had bought her in 1964. She did not cry at the service. She came home, sat on the porch, took a Polaroid of the sky at sunset, and slipped it into the album under index number 1417. She continued the work. The week after the funeral, she received 47 sympathy cards. She read each one carefully and wrote a response to each one in her cursive on the same crane stationery she had used for the past 18 years. She thanked the senders for their kindness. She did not describe her grief. She returned the casserole dishes that had arrived the week of the funeral, each one washed and dried and labeled with masking tape and the name of its owner. She drove to the Feed and Grain on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after the funeral, met with Daniel's longtime business partner, an older man named Hap Brennan, and arranged for the orderly transfer of Daniel's half of the business to Hap's son. She drove back up the hillside and continued the work. Her stepson, Calvin, called from his home in upstate New York, where he had moved in 1968 after marrying. He offered, gently, to come and stay with her for the summer. She told him that she was managing. He came anyway for 2 weeks in late June. He helped her plant a fall garden. He noticed the leather-bound logbook in the kitchen and the manila envelopes in Daniel's desk and asked no questions. When he left to drive back upstate at the end of his stay, he hugged his stepmother on the porch and said, "You and Dad were the steadiest people I ever knew. You'll be all right." He did not, in the years that followed, raise concerns about her photography. Her stepdaughter, Frida, did. The difference between the two stepchildren on this question would shape the rest of Rosalie's documentary life. Her stepdaughter, Frida Halloran, now married for 6 years to a hardware store owner named Bart Halloran, drove up to the hillside that weekend with a casserole dish and stood in the kitchen and asked her stepmother whether the Polaroid hobby was something she could let go of now that Daniel was gone. Rosalie told her gently that the hobby was the only thing she was not going to let go of. Frida Halloran returned to Pleasant Valley uneasy. She spoke to her husband Bart that evening at their dinner table. Bart Halloran had not gotten along with his father-in-law for the 8 years of their acquaintance. He had not liked the senior Becker's quiet manner, his careful speech, his refusal to participate in the kind of loud town opinions that Bart preferred. Bart had inherited from his own father a small hardware store on Main Street in Pleasant Valley, and had inherited from him also the temperament of a man whose self-regard required the active disapproval of others. He decided, that night in May of 1973, that his widowed mother-in-law was going to need supervision. He decided he was going to be the supervisor. He began driving up to the hillside on Sunday afternoons. He began asking pointed questions. He began telling people in the hardware store that the schoolteacher up on the hill had taken to photographing the sky every night and was probably losing her grip. The conversations spread the way small-town conversations spread. The Pleasant Valley Press in the spring of 1974 was a 6-page weekly with a circulation of approximately 1,200, run out of a second-floor office above the hardware store on Main Street. The publisher was a man named Walt Heffron, in his 60s, 3 years from retirement. The newest reporter, hired in September of 1973, was a 26-year-old man named Norman Vasquez. Norman had grown up in the Bronx, attended Iona College on a partial scholarship, graduated with a degree in journalism in 1972, and had spent the year and a half since graduation looking for the first full-time newspaper job that would take him. The Pleasant Valley Press was that job. He intended to use it as a stepping stone to the Poughkeepsie Journal or the Albany Times-Union. He had spent his first 6 months at the press writing routine local color filler, and he had been looking, the way young reporters always look, for the story that would carry him to the next paper. He heard at the diner on Main Street that a retired schoolteacher up on the Taconic slope had taken to photographing the sky every night since her husband had died, and that her son-in-law thought she might be losing her mind. Norman Vasquez recognized the story in approximately 12 seconds. He spent the next 4 months developing it. He interviewed Bart Halloran twice, on the record. He interviewed Frida Halloran once, off the record. He interviewed Reverend James Aldridge of First Methodist, who said, with the careful concern of a country pastor speaking on the record about a member of his own congregation, that he had observed signs of unresolved grief in the bereaved Mrs. Becker, and had, on 3 separate occasions, suggested that she might benefit from a conversation with a doctor at the Hudson River State Hospital. Norman recorded the conversation on a portable cassette recorder. He drove up to Rosalie's hillside on a Tuesday afternoon in early May of 1974, under the pretense of a feature interview about her late husband. She let him in. She gave him coffee at the kitchen table. He asked her, after 20 minutes, whether she had taken any photographs the previous evening. She said she had. He asked if he could see the most recent album. She thought for 10 seconds and then said yes. He looked through the album and saw, among the ordinary star skies, 3 Polaroids dated April 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, showing an unmistakable triangular formation of soft amber lights above the Taconic ridge. He took notes. He thanked her for her time. He drove back to Pleasant Valley. He published the piece 3 weeks later. The headline ran in 3 deck lines across the front page of the Pleasant Valley Press in 17-point bold on the morning of Wednesday, May 29, 1974. Pleasant Valley's Sky-Watching Widow. Rosalie Becker's nightly photographs of unidentified lights. Is grief driving a retired teacher into troubled observation? Beneath the headline, in the upper left of the front page, ran a black-and-white reproduction of one of her Polaroids, captured on a Pentax. The cut line read, "One of Mrs. Becker's recent photographs." Mrs. Becker insists the orange light visible above the ridge is not an aircraft. The article ran 4,000 words across pages 1, 3, and 5. It quoted Rosalie accurately on factual matters. It quoted Bart Halloran on the record 3 times, including a sentence Norman Vasquez had spent 2 interviews extracting. "I love Rosalie like as she's my own mother. But somebody in this family needs to start asking whether what she's doing is healthy." It quoted Reverend Aldridge in carefully chosen partial sentences that made his pastoral concern sound like a clinical diagnosis. It quoted Frida Halloran briefly, off the record, in a sentence that made her sound caught between loyalty to her stepmother and concern for her stepmother's well-being. It included a sidebar consultation with a Hudson River State Hospital psychiatrist who had not met Rosalie Becker, who described in general terms the symptoms of complicated grief in widowed women in late middle age, and who emphasized that he was not diagnosing the subject of the article. The implication was made and not stated. It was the most professionally executed piece of small paper hatchet work that the Pleasant Valley Press had published in its 62-year history. It was picked up by the Poughkeepsie Journal the following Sunday under the headline, "Duchess County Widow Photographs Unexplained Lights." It was picked up briefly by United Press International. It ran in condensed form in the Albany Times-Union, the Bridgeport Post, and the Newburgh Evening News over the following 10 days. Norman Vasquez was hired by the Poughkeepsie Journal in November of 1974 on the strength of the piece. He never wrote about Rosalie Becker again. Rosalie received 41 pieces of mail from out-of-state strangers in the 3 weeks following publication. She received 4 phone calls from television news producers in Albany, Hartford, and New York. She returned none of them. The First Methodist congregation acknowledged the situation through the agency of carefully averted eye contact in the church narthex on Sunday mornings. Reverend Aldridge visited her at home on June 3, 1974, and suggested, with the kind concern of a country pastor who believed he was helping, that she consider taking a few months off from the photography to give herself time to grieve properly. She listened to him for 40 minutes. She thanked him for his concern. She did not stop the work. She did stop attending First Methodist after that conversation. She did not announce her departure from the congregation, or send a letter, or make any explanation. She simply did not arrive at the 8 a.m. service on Sunday, June 9th. She did not arrive the following Sunday, or any Sunday after that. Reverend Aldridge waited 3 Sundays and then drove up the hillside again. He sat with her on the porch for an hour. She gave him tea. She did not raise her voice once during the conversation. He left, defeated and uncertain, and did not return. The pastor of the Episcopal Church in Pleasant Hill, 4 miles to the south, called her the following week and invited her gently to consider visiting his parish if she felt the need for a Sunday morning anchor. She accepted the invitation. She drove to Pleasant Hill every Sunday for the next 29 years. The Episcopal pastor, a quiet man named John Vance, never once asked her about the photography. The school district kept her on through the 1974 to 1975 school year, and through every subsequent year until her retirement in June of 1982. Her principal at Pleasant Valley Elementary, a woman named Marlene Trasker, declined to schedule any administrative meeting with her after the article appeared, and continued to schedule her for the most challenging fourth-grade rosters the school produced, year after year, in the quiet way that experienced principals communicate confidence in a teacher under siege. Rosalie's classroom in the spring of 1975 included 6 children, whose parents had openly discussed her photograph article at dinner the previous year. Those 6 children, by the end of the school year, were the 6 top readers in her class. If you have ever known a woman who was right and ridiculed for it, a woman who kept doing the work anyway after the world had laughed at her, leave a comment with her name. Hit that subscribe button so we can keep telling stories like this one. Because what Rosalie Becker did over the next 15 years, while the Hudson Valley sightings escalated quietly outside the awareness of every newspaper that had mocked her in 1974, is the part of this story that no one in Pleasant Valley would learn about until the October morning in 1989, when the New York Times Sunday edition arrived on every doorstep in the village. The 15 years between the May 1974 Pleasant Valley Press article and the autumn of 1989 were the most productive period of Rosalie Becker's documentary life. She continued the practice of photographing the sky on every clear evening from the porch, the back garden, or the small cedar-shingled shed that she designed and supervised the construction of in the summer of 1975. The shed was built by a local carpenter named Earl Whitaker, who was Daniel Becker's older brother and had been one of the only members of the Becker extended family who had defended Rosalie publicly during the spring of '74. He charged her nothing for the labor. The shed went up in 3 weekends. It was 10 feet by 12 feet, cedar shingled on the exterior with a single south-facing window with a white-painted wooden frame, a hinged wooden sky panel cut into the roof on the north slope, an interior partition that separated a small darkroom from a small observation area, a worn pine desk under the sky panel, a wall shelf along the north wall that would eventually hold 46 leather-bound albums, a wall map of the lower Hudson Valley covering the east wall, a small electric space heater for winter use, and a single bare bulb on a pull chain. She moved her growing archive into the shed in October of 1975. The Pleasant Valley Press piece had cost her social standing in the town, but had not cost her her network. The witnesses she had been compiling references to since 1969 continued to call her. Local pilots who had seen things at low altitude that they were not going to report to their employers continued to call her. Truck drivers on Route 9 and Route 44, who had pulled over to watch silent lights drift across the Taconic Ridge, continued to stop at her hillside on their way north or south. A small civilian astronomy club in Poughkeepsie, founded in 1978, quietly invited her to attend meetings without asking her to disclose what she was actually documenting. She accepted the invitation, attended for 4 years, and made friends among the amateur astronomers who knew, by the late '70s, what kind of records she was keeping, and never said so aloud in the meeting room. Earl Whitaker, Daniel's brother and the carpenter who had built the photo shed in 1975, visited Rosalie every Sunday afternoon for the next 11 years. He was a widower himself, 3 years older than Daniel had been, with no children. He sat on the porch with Rosalie after she returned from the Pleasant Hill Episcopal service and drank a single cup of black coffee with her and read the Sunday paper section that she handed him, while she read the section she had reserved for herself. They did not always speak. They did not always need to. He was the only person in the Becker family, besides her stepson Calvin, who had defended her publicly in the spring of '74. He had walked into Bart Halloran's hardware store on Main Street on the Saturday morning after the Pleasant Valley Press article had appeared, asked for 10-penny nails, paid for them with a $5 bill, accepted his change, and said in a flat, steady voice that everyone in the store could hear, "My brother Daniel believed in his wife's good sense for 18 years. I believe in it too. If you do not, you and I have a problem." He walked out of the store without waiting for a response. He did not enter the hardware store again for the rest of his life. He died in 1986, on a Sunday afternoon, in the chair on Rosalie's porch where he had been reading the paper. Rosalie was the one who closed his eyes. She placed his glasses on the porch railing and called the ambulance. The Hudson Valley sightings began to escalate in the autumn of 1982. The first widely witnessed event occurred on the night of December 31st, 1982, when a massive boomerang-shaped formation of soft amber lights was reported by approximately 50 witnesses in Yorktown Heights and surrounding Westchester County. The local newspapers covered it once and dropped it. The pattern continued. By the end of 1983, the sightings had spread north into Putnam County and were being reported at a rate of approximately 2 events per week along a corridor that ran from the lower Hudson north to the Dutchess County line. By 1985, the corridor extended to Dutchess County. By 1987, the corridor extended across the river into Orange and Ulster counties. Rosalie's archive grew. She bought a third Polaroid SX70 in 1983 and rotated cameras to spread the wear. She bought a second leather-bound logbook in 1985 and a third in 1987. She extended her wall map of the lower Hudson Valley to include the southern portion of the corridor on a second pinned section. She maintained 4 colors of pin: red for boomerang formations, blue for single craft sightings, green for stationary hovering lights, and yellow for events with multiple distinct craft in non-formation patterns. She added a 5th practice in 1983. She began collecting written witness statements from the local pilots, truck drivers, and night shift workers who continued to call her. She gave each statement an index number, filed it in a manila folder, and cross-referenced it to her own photographs by date and approximate time. By the end of 1988, she had collected 1,143 sworn witness statements in addition to her own photographic record. The statements arrived by every method available to her witnesses. Some were typed and mailed. Some were handwritten and slipped under her front door at night. Some were dictated to her at her kitchen table over coffee. A few were carried up the hillside in person by the Pleasant Valley postmistress, B. Talmadge, who in 1983 had quietly told a Hopewell Junction commercial pilot named Reed McAvoy that if he wanted to give his report to someone who would actually keep it, he should drive up the hill on Burbridge Road and ask for Mrs. Becker. By the end of 1985, B. Talmadge had become the informal switchboard for the entire Pleasant Valley reporting network. She would never describe herself in those terms. She would say, when pressed years later, that she had simply known where the postal route ended and where the records that mattered actually began. The witnesses came from every demographic category that a sociologist studying the Hudson Valley sightings would have found surprising. They included a Republican state senator from Putnam County who reported a boomerang formation from his car window on the Taconic Parkway in March of 1984, and asked Rosalie in writing to redact his name in any future use of his statement. She redacted it. The original statement remained in her archive under a coded reference. She was, by the end of 1988, holding the most carefully assembled body of corroborated testimony about the Hudson Valley sightings in existence. No one outside her network knew it existed. The combined archive, by January of 1989, was the most thorough single-observer civilian record of the Hudson Valley sightings in existence. No one in Pleasant Valley knew about it except Earl Whitaker, who had died in 1986, and B. Talmadge, the retired postmistress of Pleasant Valley, who had quietly stopped by every Tuesday afternoon since 1976 to sit with Rosalie for an hour, and never once asked her what was in the cedar shed. Eleanor Pruitt of the New York Times Metropolitan Desk had been working on the Hudson Valley sightings story since June of 1989. She was 36 years old, had been at the Times for 9 years, had spent the previous decade working her way up from the Long Island Regional Bureau, and had finally been given a free-rein investigative slot in the spring of 1989 after her editor had become convinced that the Hudson Valley sightings were not a folk story, but a serious, unreported phenomenon. Eleanor had spent the summer of '89 driving through Westchester, Putnam, and Dutchess counties, interviewing witnesses, reading back issues of regional papers, and trying to find the through line that would carry her piece. She had interviewed pilots, police officers, a former Yorktown town supervisor, 3 commercial truck drivers, and the priest of a Catholic parish in Brewster, who had seen a boomerang formation from his rectory window in March of 1986. She had assembled a working draft of 12,000 words by the end of August. She did not yet have the corroborating documentation that would convince her editor and his editor to put the story on the front page. The corroborating documentation had been the obstacle all summer. The witnesses she had interviewed were credible individually. They were also impossible to verify collectively. A police officer in Yorktown Heights could describe what he had seen with the precision of a trained observer. He could not produce the photograph that would prove what he had seen. A commercial pilot in Stewart Airport could describe the geometry of a formation in technical detail. He could not produce the radar tape that would corroborate his account. The institutional silence around the wave had not only suppressed the public conversation, it had also suppressed the institutional records that would have made the wave provable. Eleanor had been searching throughout the summer for the private record that the institutions had not produced. She had heard rumors of one. She had heard, in 3 separate interviews, that there was somewhere in the valley a person who had been photographing the sky for years. She had not been able to confirm the rumor. She had not been able to find the person. The rumor named different people: a retired air traffic controller in Newburgh, a widow in Fishkill, a high school physics teacher in Beacon. Each lead had ended in a closed door or a denial. When Vern Hostetter mentioned a retired schoolteacher in Pleasant Valley over the phone on the evening of September 28th, Eleanor recognized the rumor's true shape for the first time. She wrote the address Vern Hostetter gave her on the inside cover of her reporter's notebook in pencil and underlined it twice. She heard about Rosalie Becker in late September from a Poughkeepsie Astronomy Club member who had been one of Rosalie's quiet acquaintances since 1978. The man, a retired engineer named Vern Hostetter, told Eleanor in a phone call from his living room that there was a woman in Pleasant Valley who had been photographing the sky every clear evening since 1969, and that her archive contained, by his last informal count, somewhere in the range of 18,000 dated photographs. Eleanor asked Vern Hostetter for an address. He gave her one. She called Rosalie Becker's house on October 2nd. Rosalie did not pick up. Eleanor called again on October 4th, October 6th, and October 8th. Rosalie listened to the recorded messages on her answering machine, sat at her kitchen table for an hour each time, and did not return the calls. On October 9th, 1989, at 3:20 in the afternoon, a chartered car from Poughkeepsie pulled into the gravel driveway of the hillside property in Pleasant Valley. A young woman with short auburn hair stepped out, carrying a tan canvas messenger bag and a small microcassette recorder. She walked up the gravel path to the porch. Rosalie was on the porch. She had seen the car turn off the country road. She had walked down from the photo shed and was standing at the porch railing with a cup of tea in her hand. Eleanor Pruitt climbed the 3 porch steps. She introduced herself. She showed Rosalie her press credential from the New York Times. She said, "I have spoken to many people in this valley over the past 5 months. I have not yet spoken to anyone whose record is supposed to be as careful as yours. May I come in?" Rosalie looked at her for a long moment. Then she set down the teacup, opened the screen door, and said, "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table for an hour before they went out to the shed. Rosalie boiled water for fresh tea on the stovetop, served it in 2 ceramic mugs with a small pitcher of cream from the refrigerator, and listened to the young reporter's questions in silence for the first 10 minutes before she answered any of them. Eleanor Pruitt had begun by asking about Daniel Becker. Rosalie answered. Eleanor asked about the spring of 1974 and the Pleasant Valley Press article. Rosalie answered briefly. She had not spoken about that article aloud in 15 years. Eleanor asked about the photographs. Rosalie set down her tea and said, "You'll need to see them." They walked out the back door, up the gravel path, and to the cedar shed. Rosalie unlocked the door with a small brass key from her apron pocket. She opened the door. Eleanor walked in. The interior was lit at that hour by a single bare bulb, hanging from a pull chain over the pine desk. The wall map of the lower Hudson Valley covered the east wall, 8 feet wide, stuck with 1,471 colored pushpins. The wall shelf along the north wall held 46 leather-bound Polaroid albums in chronological order, each one labeled in Rosalie's neat cursive with a date range and an album number. The pine desk under the open sky panel held the Polaroid SX70, the Polaroid Land Camera Model 250, the 3 leather-bound logbooks, and a small box of unused film. The darkroom partition stood at the east end of the shed. The space heater was on. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room for 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "How many?" Rosalie said, 18,247 Polaroids, 1,143 written witness statements, 3 logbooks, 20 years and 6 months as of yesterday. Eleanor said, "May I look?" Rosalie said, "You may." They worked at the pine desk until the sky outside the south window turned indigo, then deep teal, then black. Eleanor opened albums 1 through 4, then 10 through 14, then 20 through 25, then 40 through 46. She turned the Polaroids carefully by the white borders. She read the index logbook in parallel. She found, among the 18,000 ordinary night skies, the small dense cluster of anomalous photographs that Rosalie had cross-referenced in pencil. She found the December 1982 cluster. She found the spring 1985 cluster. She found the autumn 1987 cluster. She found the cluster from the spring of 1984 that had occurred during a 6-week period in which Rosalie had been hospitalized for a minor surgery, and had still managed to photograph the sky from her hospital window on the 7 evenings during which the sky had been clear and the angle had been workable. She found the small handwritten post-it notes that Rosalie had stuck to the inside back covers of certain albums, indicating that a particular witness statement had been cross-referenced against a particular photograph, and that the two records corroborated each other within a margin of 15 minutes. She found the index of cross-references in the third logbook, which ran for 47 pages and was the most carefully compiled corroboration index she had ever seen produced by a private citizen on any subject in her decade at the New York Times. She paused at the 7th album, the one covering the autumn of 1974, and looked up at Rosalie. She said, "You kept doing this through the worst weeks of the article." Rosalie said, "The sky did not stop being a thing that needed to be photographed, because Norman Vasquez had decided what kind of person I was." Eleanor wrote the sentence down on the inside cover of her reporter's notebook. She wrote, in her own private shorthand below it, the word that experienced reporters write at the moment they understand they are sitting across from a source whose record is going to break a story open. The word was keep. She did not show Rosalie what she had written. She continued through the albums. She continued for another 3 hours. She found photograph number 16,412, dated June 15, 1988, showing the unmistakable silhouette of a massive, boomerang-shaped formation of soft, amber lights against the Taconic ridge, framed exactly the way Rosalie had been framing the Taconic ridge from her back porch for 19 years. Eleanor switched on her microcassette recorder at 6:40 p.m. and recorded the rest of the conversation. Rosalie explained the indexing methodology. She explained the witness statement collection. She explained the color-coded pin system on the wall map. She explained, for the first time aloud to anyone outside her circle, what the corridor running south from Dutchess through Putnam through Westchester actually showed. Eleanor asked permission to photograph the wall map and the open albums. Rosalie granted it. Eleanor asked permission to interview Rosalie on the record. Rosalie considered the question for 2 minutes. Then she said, "You may, but you will quote me only on what I am willing to be quoted on. And you will reproduce my photographs only with my written permission." Eleanor said, "Yes, ma'am." Rosalie said, "Then you may." The article ran on the front page of the New York Times Sunday edition on October 15, 1989. The headline ran across 4 columns above the fold in 20-point bold. Hudson Valley Lights. A 7-year wave of unexplained sightings, and the private archive of one Pleasant Valley widow who recorded it all. The photographs, the official explanation cannot account for. The article ran 8,400 words. It continued across the front page, the entirety of page A12, the entirety of page A13, and the upper half of page A14. It quoted Rosalie Becker 16 times, all on factual matters about her indexing methodology. It quoted Eleanor's previous summer interviews with the pilots, police officers, town supervisor, truck drivers, and rectory priest. It quoted the FAA's official explanation about ultralight aircraft from Stormville, and reproduced, in a single paragraph on page A13, the specific evidence that contradicted the FAA's explanation. Aircraft altitude, formation size, silent operation, witness count, duration. It noted, in a single, careful paragraph on the front page, that the Pleasant Valley Press article of May 29, 1974, was reproduced in full as a sidebar on page A14. It included 6 photographic reproductions of Rosalie's Polaroids, with her written permission, arranged in chronological sequence to show the visual continuity of the formations across the 7-year wave. The article was carried in the Sunday edition of the New York Times to 1,170,000 readers across the metropolitan area. It was picked up the following Tuesday by the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the San Francisco Chronicle. It was the subject of a 4-minute segment on the CBS Sunday morning broadcast on October 22nd. The Sunday morning segment was filmed on the porch of the Hillside farmhouse on a cold October Tuesday, with a small CBS crew that Rosalie had agreed to admit on the strict condition that no footage be shot inside the photo shed, and that the cedar shed itself appear only in a single establishing wide shot from outside the property line. The crew honored the agreement. The correspondent, a woman named Frances Reynolds who had been at CBS for 14 years, sat with Rosalie on the porch for 90 minutes of recorded conversation, of which 40 seconds were used in the final segment. The 40 seconds showed Rosalie answering, in her quiet, careful schoolteacher's voice, a single question. The question was, what do you think people will remember about the Hudson Valley sightings in 50 years? Rosalie's answer was, I do not think people will remember the sightings. I think they will remember that ordinary people watched the sky in this valley for 7 years, and were not believed, and kept watching anyway. That answer was the only on-record statement that Rosalie Becker ever gave for broadcast television in her life. It became, in the years afterward, the line most frequently quoted in academic accounts of the Hudson Valley wave. The CBS crew packed up their equipment at 4:30 p.m., shot the establishing wide of the cedar shed from outside the property line at sunset, and drove out the gravel driveway. Rosalie watched their van disappear down the country road. She went inside, made herself a cup of tea, and went up to the cedar shed and photographed the night sky for the 8,044th time. The book Night Siege, by Dr. J. Allen Hynek and his co-authors, which had been published in October of 1987 and had quietly chronicled the early years of the Hudson Valley sightings, returned to limited reprint by the end of the year. Rosalie Becker became, for the next 18 months, the most quietly famous private observer of unidentified aerial phenomena in the United States. She declined every television interview. She declined invitations from the Mutual UFO Network, the Center for UFO Studies, and the National UFO Reporting Center to address their respective annual conferences. She gave one further interview, a follow-up profile to Eleanor Pruitt for the New York Times Sunday Magazine in March of 1990, in which she answered for the first time questions about her late husband Daniel's encouragement of her photographic practice. She gave no further interviews after that. Bart Halloran was now 54 years old. He had operated the Pleasant Valley hardware store for 25 years. He read the New York Times Sunday article in the kitchen of his house in Pleasant Valley on the morning of October 15, 1989. He read it twice. He did not finish his coffee. He stood up, walked out the back door of his house, drove to his hardware store, opened the store as he did every Sunday morning, and sat at the front counter for 2 hours without speaking to a single customer. He never called Rosalie about it. He never apologized. He continued to operate the hardware store for another 11 years. He died of a heart attack in 2000 at the age of 65. His daughter, Rosalie's step-granddaughter, Imogene Doss, wrote her step-grandmother a letter in 2001 that began with the sentence, "He never knew how to say what he should have said." Rosalie kept the letter in the cedar shed in a folder labeled Halloran. B. The folder remains in the archive. Norman Vasquez was now 41 years old. He had left the Poughkeepsie Journal in 1979 after 5 years, had spent a decade at the Albany Times-Union as a city government reporter, had taken a public relations position with a Hudson Valley pharmaceutical company in 1988, and had been the company's director of corporate communications by 1989. He read the New York Times article on the morning of October 15th in the lobby of his office building in Tarrytown. He read it 3 times. He did not finish his coffee either. He wrote Rosalie a long letter, 6 pages, longhand, on personal stationery, in November of 1989. He mailed it to her Pleasant Valley address. She read it once. She did not reply. She filed it in a manila folder in the cedar shed labeled Vasquez, N. The original 1974 Pleasant Valley Press article remained in the bound back-issue archive in the basement of the building where the press was still printed, now under different ownership, until the building was demolished in 1998. The article does not appear in any online newspaper archive that exists today. Reverend James Aldridge had died of natural causes in 1983. He never knew about the New York Times article. Of the 3 people who had publicly contributed to Rosalie's humiliation in 1974, only Bart Halloran lived to see the vindication. He never acknowledged it aloud. By the spring of 1990, the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago had formally requested copies of the Becker archive. Rosalie sent them photocopies of the entire logbook, photographic reproductions of 100 selected anomalous Polaroids, and the full set of 1,143 witness statements, retaining the originals. The center cataloged the donation as the Becker Hudson Valley Sky Index, accession number BHVS-1990-001 through BHVS-1990-1457. The Mutual UFO Network's New York chapter sent 2 researchers to the cedar shed in May of 1990. She gave them 4 hours of her time. She allowed them to photograph the wall map. She answered their methodological questions in detail. The Pleasant Valley Press, now under different ownership, ran a corrective profile of Rosalie Becker on the front page of the Wednesday edition of June 6, 1990. The byline belonged to a 24-year-old reporter named Wendell Ash, who had grown up in Pleasant Valley and had been a 4th-grade student in Rosalie's classroom in 1975. He wrote the piece carefully, including a 1-paragraph explicit acknowledgement that the paper's 1974 article had been wrong. Rosalie did not respond to the corrective piece. She placed a clipped copy of it in a manila folder in the cedar shed labeled Pleasant Valley Press, 1990. The folder remains in the archive. The First Methodist Church on the village green hung a small framed reproduction of the New York Times article in its narthex bulletin board in the autumn of 1990. It was put up by the new pastor, a woman named Esther Aldridge, who was no relation to the previous Reverend Aldridge of 1974. The frame remains there. Rosalie continued the documentary practice from the cedar shed for another 14 years. The archive grew. She photographed the night sky on every clear evening between October 16, 1989, and the night of October 22, 2003, which was the last photograph she took. She died of natural causes in her sleep on the morning of November 4th, 2003, at the age of 71. She was found by B. Talmadge, the retired postmistress, who came up the hillside on a routine Tuesday afternoon visit and discovered her sitting in her armchair in the living room with a closed Polaroid album in her lap. The will she had filed with a Pleasant Valley attorney in 1992 specified in a single typed paragraph that the entire contents of the Cedar photo shed were to be donated to the Center for UFO Studies, with the further provision that the Polaroid archive, the leather-bound logbooks, and the wall map of the lower Hudson Valley would remain together as a single unit and not be separated. The donation was completed in March of 2004. The collection is catalogued today as the permanent Becker Hudson Valley Sky Index. It is regarded by civilian unidentified aerial phenomenon researchers as one of the most thorough multi-decade single-observer wave records in North American documentation, and the single most thorough photographic record of the Hudson Valley sightings of 1982 through 1989. The aspect of the Becker archive that subsequent researchers most frequently identified as distinctive was the negative space. Of the 18,247 photographs in the index, fewer than 1,500 showed anything anomalous. The remaining 16,747 photographs documented ordinary night skies. The completeness of the negative record was the feature that distinguished the archive from every other private record of the wave. A photograph of an empty sky on a clear evening when no anomaly was observed had, on its own, no value. A photograph of an empty sky on a clear evening when no anomaly was observed, cross-referenced against a logbook entry confirming that the photographer had been present and watching, established a denominator. A denominator was the prerequisite for any meaningful statistical analysis of the wave. Most civilian observers of aerial phenomena in the 1980s had photographed only the events. They had no records of the absences. Rosalie Becker had records of every clear evening, anomalous or not, across 20 years and 6 months. The denominator was as complete as the numerator. The archive, to a careful researcher, was therefore not primarily a record of sightings. It was a record of attention. The sightings were a fraction of what the attention had captured. The cedar shed itself was disassembled in 2006 and rebuilt as a permanent exhibit in a small civilian aerospace museum in Newburgh, New York. The wall map remains intact. The red and blue and green and yellow pushpins are in the same positions where the schoolteacher placed them. Visitors to the Newburgh Museum exhibit, which opened to the public in May of 2007, walk into a reconstructed cedar shed at scale, with the wall map of the lower Hudson Valley occupying the east wall and the leather-bound albums arranged on a wall shelf in chronological order behind protective glass. A short caption beneath the wall map identifies the period of the archive as 1969 through 2003, and the total photograph count as 18,413. The caption does not name the subject of the wave. It does not need to. The visitors stand in the small reconstructed shed and look at the corridor of pushpins on the map and at the silver and leatherette Polaroid SX70 in a glass case beside the desk, and they understand, without being told, that the work they are looking at was the kind of work that one careful person can do, alone, when the institutions that should have done it have decided, for whatever reason, not to. Eleanor Pruitt remained at the New York Times until 2014, when she retired as a deputy investigative editor. She has said in interviews that the October 15, 1989 article remains the work she is most proud of. She visited Rosalie every March until Rosalie's death, and once more alone, in March of 2004, after the cedar shed had been emptied. The 1974 Pleasant Valley Press article by Norman Vasquez is not cited in any published account of the Hudson Valley sightings. The 1989 Pruitt article is cited in every serious account. Rosalie Becker refused to accept that what she was seeing was nothing. She kept doing the work after she had been publicly humiliated for doing it. She was right, and she was patient, and she was alone for 15 years, and the country that had laughed at her in 1974 finally caught up to her on a Sunday morning in October of 1989, when one careful young reporter at one major paper sat at her kitchen table, drank her tea, walked up her gravel path to her cedar shed, and saw what she had been seeing all along. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. Quiet vindication is rare, and it is rarer still when the witness is a widow on a Hudson Valley hillside who was never going to ask anyone to come and find her. It deserves to be remembered.